try to send a message. We try to energize, we try to pass what we think is the best. And I guess every great story starts with few people sitting somewhere and believing first in themselves and then believing in something that everybody else believes it's not possible. And maybe the continuation of our keynotes goes in that direction. In 2016, saying something about IT maybe sounds incredible. In 2023, saying something about biotech, biomed is maybe even more incredible if you're thinking about Serbia. But there are always people that you can learn from, and there are people who are willing to cross the oceans to share the knowledge. And we are very happy today to have one person like that with us. So I'm very happy to announce and give you the next presenter, Nguyen, and I apologize if I butcher your name. Here is your, there you go.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Second time in Belgrade and loving it again. So I apologize to the videographer. I'm going to pace around a little bit. But today, I'm going to share a little bit about kind of what my team and I focus on from a medical informatics standpoint. And I'm sure many of you haven't heard that before. And how we kind of bridge this gap between what we try to do on the AI data science side and then patient-centered healthcare. And how do we really bridge these different disciplines and then drive impact for patients. So more or less today is just a culmination of my experience. I was in academia, then I went down the startup route as a founder, as an early stage employee. I am not a billionaire, unfortunately. But then went back to academia as a professor, trying to inspire sort of the next generation of health informatics professionals, but then now going back over into the life science industry. And so really just bringing all these things together, and ultimately, what can we do together? And so why are we here today? I think in one word from what I've seen so far, it's really about innovation. And when we think about innovation, my first thought is it's hard, right? Having tried to do it, I'm sure all of you are dealing with different challenges right now. But I think when we look in industries like healthcare, it's even harder, right? Just because it's a complex industry, there's a lot of things going on, and ultimately we're trying to do things for patients. And so at Roche, we try to put patients first. If you look at any of our slide decks, we always end with doing now what patients need next. And for me, even though I'm on the tech side, I love writing code, I started life as an embedded software engineer, I really do consider myself a healthcare professional. And so just to understand the audience a little bit better, and then maybe to help you stretch out a little bit, I'd like you to stand up if you consider yourself scientifically or technically oriented. So this is regardless of what industry you're in, you write code, you're a scientist, you're a clinician. Will anybody stand up? Awesome. Okay, thank you. And then what about from healthcare life sciences? So you might be an administrator, you're on the business side, maybe you're a clinician, researcher, scientist. Stand up if you're in healthcare or life science. Yeah, you touch life science in some way, okay, awesome. And then this is the opportunity for everybody to stand up now, right? So who's been a patient? You might be healthy, you just go in for routine checkups, you have an acute issue, I injured myself recently, right? Or you have a chronic condition. And for anybody in the room who works with ICD codes, the joke here is that you're just not otherwise specified yet. And so why talk about this, and what's my point? And I think Dragan mentioned this in his slides a bit, about changing perspective. And so for us, I think it's really important that we look through different lenses. And ultimately, the key takeaway here, and I'll have a few of these slides with the little light bulb, it's how do we look through a variety of different lenses and then ultimately embrace all the different perspectives out there. And one question that I always ask myself, and I think you should ask yourselves, is are you sure? Right? What assumptions are we making? What are we thinking about when it comes to the technology, the patients, and what we're trying to do in healthcare, and really challenging ourselves as a result. So today, I'm gonna go through a couple different perspectives, one from being an entrepreneur, and then as a healthcare professional, and then ultimately as an engineer. And so for me, it's really about looking through different lenses and really being able to shape what our perception of the world is. And so here is a graphic of a random forest. And so how many data scientists do we have in the room? You can raise your hand, you don't have to stand up. Okay, so I think if you talk to any of these data scientists, they're gonna say random forests are old school, right? We've been doing them for a long time. Yeah, they perform really well if we have good data. They help us explain a bit, but they're not necessarily exciting. And then we look at something like this, deep learning network. I particularly am really interested in graph machine learning, and I think graphs are a really great way to represent patient data. The diagnoses, the medication, the lab values, all of these things coming together. This tends to get people really excited if you're in the data science, AI, machine learning world. But these are patients. And do you think they really care at the end of the day if we have a random forest or a graph machine learning network or whatever deep learning architecture you want to use? They're trying to get through a medical condition. Their clinicians are trying to help them. We're trying to help improve human health. We don't necessarily care what the underlying technology is, but it doesn't mean there isn't innovation. And so, let's just take one of these patients and drill down a bit. So we have a paper here that I read recently, and it's called Structured Prompt Interrogation and Recursive Extraction of Semantics. And when I read this, I had no idea what it meant. And I read the paper because somebody told me I should read it. But then when I started looking into it, reading the paper, understanding it a little bit better, and then my team and I started experimenting with the underlying library here, which is called OntoGPT. So GPT uses large language models and generative AI. And what we're trying to do here is use these language models to parse through scientific literature, to parse through clinical notes that physicians and nurses write on their patients, and can we extract structured knowledge as a result of that? So I think this is super cool. I think it's innovative. I don't necessarily think this patient does. But then we start looking at these other headlines, right? An AI model to help predict adverse events. So what's an adverse event from drug combinations? You take drug A and everything's okay. You take drug B and everything's okay. You take these two together and then something bad happens, right? There's an adverse event as a result of it. And so another example of this is some folks on my team are working using graph-based neural networks and other machine learning techniques to try to detect and predict adverse events that might happen. So now this is something that gets closer to what's going to benefit a patient, what's going to improve the healthcare industry overall. But not all the innovation is necessarily technical. And so this is an example of a clinical registry that's being developed right now. And here the technology isn't the fancy part, right? The idea is how do we build a clinical registry across multiple cancers across the entire world so that we know our data is representative of the entire human population. And the key thing here, and I think the takeaway, is that innovation, especially in healthcare, but I think this is true in all industries, takes many forms. And it's not always about the technology, right? I think a lot of us love technology, we love doing new and cool things, but how do we focus on impact instead? And in healthcare especially, sometimes the innovation we're seeing is a new risk model or a new care model, right? So it's a new business model essentially that we can bring into a really complex industry. And I think that's where startups and entrepreneurs have a huge opportunity for impact. And so we look at, okay, how do we actually have this impact, right? We have problems, we have solutions, we're trying to figure this out. The natural challenge here with these two arrows is that we don't necessarily know where to start, right? Do we start with the problem or do we start with the solution? And where do we focus our efforts? If we start with the solution and we work back towards the problem, and I think this is what, as a technologist, what I normally do. I see a new technology, I want to try it. I go shopping for problems, whether it's within Roche or whether it's within the industry overall. But the challenge that we run here is that we built this awesome hammer. And so if you have a really cool hammer in your hand, what do you try to do? You run around bashing everything. And so the challenge here is that everything starts to look like a potential problem for us, even if it's not a good fit. And right now, LLMs, large language models, generative AI, everybody's talking about it. And I see everybody running around sort of with this hammer trying to solve different problems. Is it going to have huge impact? Absolutely. Is it always a right tool for the job? Not necessarily. And if you look at some of what we're doing at Roche, for example, one of our companies, Prescient Designs, is working on AI-based drug discovery. And so part of the strategy is to try to use large language models and generative AI for that. But I think we always need to be asking ourselves, are these the actual right tool for the job? So how do we balance against this? Let's focus on the problem, let's understand the problem, and come back towards a solution. I think the challenge that we run to here, okay, and I was afraid this may not be readable in the crowd, but Steve Jobs had this quote, and I'm sure many of you have seen it before, but he's channeling Henry Ford and said, if we ask our users what they want, they would say they want a faster horse. And that's because people couldn't conceptualize cars at the time, right? If I don't know to ask for a car, I'm not going to ask for a car. And so how do we get into the hands of users what they want before they know they want it? But the challenge with this is that if we focus too much on the user and their current thinking and their current approach to problem solving, we may end up only with incremental progress. We end up in a situation where we get so siloed in tunnel vision in a way of thinking that we don't necessarily see the entire forest, right? We're just staring at this one tree in front of us. And we miss out on that disruptive innovation that we all want and that we all need. And so if we come back to this idea of the problem and solution and knowing where to start, and I really like this idea of iteration, we have to be agile in our thinking. We have to try something, we have to learn from it, and then we have to move on. But from there, what we really need is sort of this self-awareness, right? We need to stop and reflect and say, what did I learn in this last iteration, and what am I gonna do in my next iteration? And am I on the right path? Am I listening to my users? Am I listening to the market? But at the same time, am I not focusing so much on that I end up not making as much progress that I possibly could? And so how do we balance back and forth between the problems and solutions? So we have the sort of mindset of an entrepreneur, and let's start thinking about how a healthcare professional then looks at some of this. And so anybody who's dealt with products, right, and trying to build products, these are some of the questions that oftentimes come up. Who's gonna use my product? Who's gonna benefit from the use of this product? And then ultimately, who pays for it? And so if you think about a cell phone or like a task management app or something, I'm the one who uses Trello or Asana or whatever tool out there. I benefit because it saves me 5-10 minutes a day, and then I choose to spend $3 a month or whatever the subscription fee is for this. So it's pretty straightforward to try to work through this. But then we have what I call the healthcare triangle, and I know it's not a triangle but a circle, but I call it the triangle. And the idea here is that we have sort of this complexity that comes in. We have patients, we have their families, their caregivers, we have clinicians, administrators, and ultimately, if we take the example of adverse events from before, who's gonna use this? Well, it's probably a physician. They're gonna build into electronic health record, they're gonna order a drug for a patient, and the system's gonna say, hey, patient's on this other drug, you're asking for the second drug, it might cause an adverse event. But who benefits from the use of this? Well, the patient obviously benefits. They're trying to get through their medical condition. We don't wanna add another problem to that. And then who pays, right? Is it the public insurance fund? Is it private insurance that we have in the US, or should the hospital pay for this? Or you know what, since this is gonna help the patient, we'll just charge them even more and help make them pay for this. And so right away, as we start to look for this product market fit, it becomes really hard, right? It becomes much more challenging to try to figure this out. And working through this becomes non-trivial. And so this is a screenshot from Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. I ended up choosing this movie because I asked DALL-E to create me an image and I just couldn't prompt it correctly. But this is a mountain of Jell-O, that's what I wanted. And I basically say this is healthcare, right? It's the healthcare system that we have, and we're trying to move this mountain of Jell-O from the system that we have today to the system that we want and the system that we need to have tomorrow. And so we have healthcare professionals, and for those of you who stood up earlier, I'm sure if I say, what problems do you have in healthcare, there's a whole list of them. And then we engage data scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs. This is not an exhaustive list, but we look for help, right? We're asking for help from tech and from entrepreneurs and whatnot to really help us move this mountain. The problem is we send them in by themselves, and they just, you push on a mountain of Jell-O by yourself, and what happens? You fall right into that mountain. And I think this highlights what happens when we take sort of a siloed thinking. If we only think about the technology and nothing else, what do we get? We get a lot of these headlines that have come out. I think IBM Watson being sort of the big one that a lot of us think about is after hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, we found out that it produces unsafe and incorrect treatment recommendations. And so how do we avoid these types of failures? And for me, the takeaway here is we need to come together, right? Whether you're a patient, whether you're a physician or a healthcare system, whether you're part of the insurance fund, a researcher, whatever it might be, we need to come together and we need to cooperate. We need to push on this mountain together. It's gonna take the whole village of us. And then we need to compete, I think, to some degree. We need to keep each other honest. We need to find the best solutions possible. And in the San Francisco Bay Area, we use this term a lot, and it's co-opetition, right? And just highlighting the need to both cooperate with, but also compete against each other at the same time. And then in the process of all of this, we gotta figure out how to pay for this, right? And so that's where the business model and the business side of it comes in. So let's shift a little bit and then think about, okay, from an engineering standpoint, what do we think about and how do we approach this? So this is the AbioCore fully implantable artificial heart. It was one of my first projects as I was transitioning from my undergraduate studies into industry as an engineer, and then I started working on unmanned airplanes. And so in both of these situations, I was an embedded software engineer. I was working alongside mechanical engineers, aerospace engineers, biomedical engineers, and neither one of us by ourselves could produce these products, right? To make a plane fly, to have a heart that we could just replace your actual heart with. And this really started teaching me how to think at the systems level, right? How do all of these parts come together, and how do they come together in a way that we're able to solve these really complex problems? And this is just a diagram of healthcare data, right? Real world data, what we call real world data in pharma, in the sense that this is data generated during the routine delivery of healthcare. And we have disease registries, like I had mentioned earlier. You know, we have claims data from insurance and how we pay for healthcare, wearables. We have a lot of options here. And already trying to figure out how to bring these all together becomes non-trivial, right? We have embedded systems, we have cloud-based systems, we have local on-prem things, even just from a technology standpoint. But if we drill into even one of those circles, and hospital data being one example, this is what I call the real-world data journey, but we have to generate representative data, right? And so sometimes that comes from the hospital, but increasingly, and one person on my team is leading a project that we have with an organization called RareX, where we're working directly with patients to collect data on rare diseases, because we know that in any given hospital, there's not a lot of data on these diseases. And so are we getting and generating the data we need? How do we get access to that data? Privacy comes up all the time, right? It's like the first thing people raise their hand and say, GDPR, HIPAA, you know, all these different acronyms that we throw out there. And an example of this is a project that we have where we're building a federated machine learning and federated analytics network, where we leave data at the hospital. We send the machine learning to the hospital, train the models, and get that back in a central way. This mitigates the privacy considerations. And so this is just, I think, another example of this sort of innovation that we really need to see. Where I spend a lot of my time is contextualization. Does the data mean what I actually think it means? And are we capturing the full context and meaning of that data? And so, in an example, we are experimenting with some large language models to help harmonize different types of data, whether they're ICD codes, SNOMED codes, or even the patient text. And then ultimately, we all want to generate actionable insights, right? Physicians need a way to make improved decisions. Patients need a way to improve their decision making. And so how can we start to do this? How do we tackle this, especially from the perspective of the industry overall? And for me, and I guess you can see I like triangles, or I like groups of three, right? But we have startups, we have large companies in academia. And having kind of flowed between all of these are just my thoughts on how we can come together. But we look at large companies in academia, for example, and we do this a lot today in the pharma industry, where a lab discovers a new molecule, and then this molecule is tested, right? And we think, okay, this is promising, it's actually gonna become a medicine. A large pharma company can come in, take that through clinical trials, take that out into market, and the business model is known here, right? We just need to be able to execute and scale on this process. But what if the business model is not clear? I think this is where startups come in. We're testing in the real world. We don't know if it's gonna work or not. We don't even know if there's a business behind this, right? Like, are people actually gonna pay us for this? And I think this is the opportunity to iterate and test that. And if it works, great, right? So then a startup, and this happens often, where a startup grows and matures and becomes a large company. But in those cases where maybe that's just too hard because the industry is set up a certain way, this is where startups and large companies can partner. And companies such as Roche, for example, we have partnerships with a variety of startups to try to then scale these solutions and take them to market so patients ultimately benefit. And to me, this is really how we can all come together to do this. And if we drill in, like, how do we do this, you know, at the patient level, for example? And, you know, let's just take this example cancer patient here. Right off the bat, we know that we need a bunch of different specialists to help care for this patient, right? We have medical geneticists to handle next generation sequencing. We have their oncologist, a primary care physician. But what's interesting to me is that you turn this into a data problem, and most of the time, companies just throw more data scientists at the problem, and not necessarily taking a step back and asking, what are the actual resources that we need? What are the capabilities that we need? And for me, it's really about bringing together other backgrounds, right? We need data engineers, we need researchers, we need biostatisticians, we need clinical practice knowledge, right? So physicians, nurses, pharmacists. And to me, it becomes an interface problem bringing all these together. And I think it's really important that we figure out how to do this. And I was talking to Professor Natasha Milic yesterday, at the medical faculty at the University of Belgrade. And I think it's a really important perspective that she brings, which is, how do we actually have people who have more than one of these backgrounds, right? If I'm a physician, I need to learn about data. If I'm a data scientist, I need to learn about clinical practice. And this is a quote from Zach Kohani. He's chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard. And this bolded part, right? You need to know something about medicine. It's not just about the tech. And we need to break down these silos and work together. And where that comes in is the field of biomedical informatics. This is where I spend my time. I did not know this existed when I was choosing what to do with my career, but I fell into it. I love it, and I think we need more of it. And this is that opportunity where we bring together the development of methods and technologies on how we acquire data, how we process it, and ultimately how we leverage that patient data to improve human health. The professor in me says I can't give a talk without having books or homework. So these are just a couple books, right? If you're interested in biomedical informatics, this is a huge book. It's more of a reference on the left by Ted Shortliff here. If you're doing anything in healthcare data, I think it's absolutely critical that you know about interoperability. That's the second book. And then this third one, I think, is just a really easy to read, free online version that gives you a sense of how to work with healthcare data. So our journey here ends. I think really it's important to bring all these different perspectives together, bring in the perspective of an engineer, of a scientist, right? And how do we rely and bring all these different perspectives together? And for me, the final takeaway here is be inquisitive and ask questions. Seek to understand the different perspectives that are out there. And I think really focus on how do we talk to each other, right? How does a clinician talk to an IT person or to a data scientist? And how do we work together? And those interfaces are going to be key. And in doing so, we can challenge ourselves to work as a team. And it's this teamwork that's absolutely critical, and then doing so in the context of systems thinking. So that's it. QR code with some contact info if you want to reach out. If you are interested in healthcare data, I wrote a book recently with O'Reilly, and this just helps kind of provide a high-level overview and then how we can start to bring in graph databases and graph technology to solve some of these problems. So thank you.
Thank you.